Well, welcome back to Parables. We're on week 4 this week, journeying with the parables of Jesus. I don't know about what happened in your group on week 1, but when we talked about what is your favourite parable, the parable of the sower came up for a few people. It's actually one of my favourites as well. If you haven't read it yet in your group, pause this video now and read it and then start again because it's too long for me to read on the video. Okay, hopefully we're all caught up. This parable is so great, and I think one of the reasons why it's got a really broad and wide appeal is that it's exceptionally easy to understand, and it's also extremely timeless. When we think about people who have been maybe drawn away from the message of Jesus by the worries of the world, or by a lack of depth in their faith, we get it, don't we? There's something that resonates in our spirits and says yes. And maybe something even that just resonates in our brains and we say, I can think of someone just like that, and that happened to them. It's amazing, isn't it? That Jesus had disciples and followers around him, some of whom were with him. They got in a boat to listen to this story. But some of them were on the shore, and the ones who were on the shore, some of those would have really stayed with Jesus. The message about the kingdom would have gone deep into their lives and transformed them. And some of them, even though they had met Jesus in the flesh, didn't stick it out. It was too hard. It was maybe too costly. It's a challenge to us because I think one of the things that we can idealise in our Christian lives is meeting Jesus in the flesh. I think, do you know what? If only Jesus was here now, it would be so much easier. But this parable shows us that maybe, just maybe, there's something deeper going on that can't just be solved by Jesus being in the flesh with us now. There's something in the human heart that makes us respond in different ways. So just a bit of explanation about this parable and where it came from and what the kind of images would have meant in that culture. I guess thinking about the agrarian and farming culture in the day of Jesus, it would have been quite different to the farming culture that we have now. We now have heavy machinery. We now have all sorts of pesticides that can go in the ground, not always, but often, to make the ground clear and ready for the seed that is going to be planted. What Jesus is talking about, though, is a different type of farming. Of course, much more natural. And in those days, they would have had seed that was scattered. We talked, didn't we, on week 1 when we thought about the house built on the rock, that some of the rock in Galilee and the surrounding areas was quite near the surface. That's quite a helpful comparison to make, isn't it? Because actually it brings us back really to those times and those steps that Jesus would have physically walked on. In that landscape, the rock in some areas was really close underneath the surface of the soil. There were no pesticides. So actually, weeds would have just been everywhere. It would have been possible, of course, to weed things out, to do good ploughing. But without pesticides, weeds just grow back, don't they? We know that from our own gardens. So I guess that's something else to hold in mind. Weeds would have just been a regular run-of-the-mill thing. Jesus tells this parable about a farmer going out to sow his seed. We can talk about this a bit more later in the groups, but one of the things that I think is striking is that the farmer is fairly anonymous in this story. It's called the parable of the sower, but actually the sower has got a very small role in this whole story. He's mentioned at the beginning, but then it's all about the soil and the seed and the other things, the birds or the rock. And that's interesting to me because we can think of the sower, the farmer, as God, but also we can think of the sower and the farmer as us. We're the ones who also can spread the good news of the kingdom of Jesus around where we go. So I hope that when you go into your groups and you think about what it might mean, you think as well about what it might mean for you to not only be a type of soil, but also for you to be the farmer. You might have a bit part in someone's story. We know, don't we, that in the story of God, we are only small players. God is, of course, the main player. But we get to play a small part in sowing the seed. Then there's that middle section. That middle section in which the disciples say to Jesus, tell us what this all means. And Jesus, in typical style, doesn't quite go straight on to giving a straightforward explanation, although he does do that later. But he begins with this long quotation from Isaiah. This long quotation from Isaiah 6 might seem a bit challenging to us as we hear it, because it talks again about people who don't have ears, then who don't understand. And there's almost an expectation that many people won't understand. And actually, it almost sounds like there's a desire for many people to not understand. Now, I don't actually think that Jesus is saying that he desires for people to not understand. That he desires for people to not receive the message of the kingdom. But actually, if you look back into Isaiah 6, where this is quoted from, someone is being sent to spread the message. It's that famous verse that we know from either Lord of Sea and Sky, here I am, send me. That directly precedes this quotation. So Jesus is saying, I am the one that was sent. I said, here I am, send me to the Father. And the Father sent me, and here I am. But now I've been sent, there are many people who don't want to hear my message about the kingdom. There are many people for whom they're either just closed, their ears are closed, they're just not interested. But he's linking back and saying, but actually this, even the rejection of my message was foretold. So although it might not be a good thing, we don't need to be pressured and surprised by that. But instead, what we can do is look at what's happening, and in particular to rejoice in the harvest that comes from those who do accept the message. There are people like us who accept the message of Jesus. And the promise in this parable is that actually the fruit from our lives will overflow. There are 3 quick things that I want to share with you about themes in the passage. Then I'll leave you to go and talk about it, because it's not really one for a long video, because there's this whole explanation that Jesus himself gives us, better than any explanation that I would give. But there are 3 themes. The first theme is the grace and the generosity of God. The seed is sown liberally. It's thrown even where there is limited potential for it to grow and flourish. The grace of God is poured into our lives, day by day, hour by hour, and to those around us. The challenge is whether we accept it, of course. Secondly, there's a theme that is quite clear about the existence of spiritual warfare. A spiritual battle is taking place on that ground. There are birds that fly in, there are thorns that grow up. Jesus is very clear, including in that middle passage, that there's more going on than meets the eye. It's not just the case that the seed is sown and things grow. And thirdly, there is a theme that we need to respond and decide. It is actually for all of us to make a decision about how we respond to what Jesus says. the amazing promise of a harvest at the end can be part of our story. That actually from our lives, the fruit that comes from our lives can be sown again and again and again. But we have to decide if we want to be that good soil. And that good soil needs some tending, it needs a weed pulling out, it needs some scarecrows to scare off the birds. We need to make decisions about how we live before God. So enjoy your discussion about the parable of the sower and all that God has got to say to us in this time.